Alliance, and I'd like to welcome you to the Just Transition Funder Briefing, Cultivating Climate Disaster Capacity. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the Wallace Global Fund, Nathan Cummings Foundation, Grassroots International, the Solidarity Network, and the Overbrook Foundation. We're tremendously grateful to all of the foundations that support frontline leadership that's working at the intersection of racial justice and climate change. I am the executive director of UPROS, which is a community-based organization in Brooklyn, New York that works on environmental and social justice issues, and the co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance. And the Climate Justice Alliance is a national organization that is made up of close to 60 organizations that represent the global South living here in the United States, the communities that are most at risk of extreme weather events, those that have been suffering and enduring the environmental burdens that have been placed in their communities for many, many years. We have people out in Richmond, Detroit, the Gulf South, the Deep South, Brooklyn, and in my beloved Puerto Rico. These are organizations that have been really doing the hard work of addressing the environmental health disparities that exist in our communities from a legacy of extraction that has existed in our communities from the siting of power plants, waste transfer stations, and a lot of the environmental burdens that other communities benefit from and have really been causing havoc in the health of our children and our elders for generations. So many of the members of the Climate Justice Alliance come from the environmental justice movement, and years ago determined that our communities will be the ones most impacted by climate change. And so we then started to think about, what does that mean? How do we create a community that is able to survive the changes that are coming? We know that our communities are the ones that are going to be most impacted. And so we began basically by reclaiming the power of our traditions, knowledge, and thinking about how we move to regenerative energy. And we call that an engagement in just transition. Basically, just transition is a move away from an extractive economy to creating local livable communities that take us away from that legacy and trying to figure out economically, how do we thrive? How do we build the just relationships that are necessary for us to be able to build a community that we imagine in the future? And that's happening literally all over the United States and has been happening for a while. And so we're tremendously grateful to all of the foundations that have invested in that vision and understand that the demographics in the United States are changing and that the weather is changing at the same time. And so we're seeing more and more people moving into urban areas, more development, which means more energy, more waste, more of everything that is toxic without creating buildings that are carbon neutral, without looking at a strategy that is going to move us away from that. And so we have had to figure out, how do we do that? How do we do that in the urban landscape, and how do we do that in the rural landscape? And what does climate adaptation and resilience mean for communities of color that have been having to deal with issues like racial violence, displacement, and now climate change? All of these things are things that challenge our social cohesion and make us particularly susceptible to all the extreme weather events. There is a love with storm surges like the ones that we suffered in New York City through Sandy because they're violent and they're extreme and they just have great optics. But we also know that our communities are going to have to deal with things like extreme heat. And a recent study done by the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance shows that those people who are living in public housing will be the ones most impacted by extreme heat in New York City. So climate change shows up in a lot of different ways in all of our communities, but very much has the same impacts that have to do with our health, with basically displacing us. And we're seeing that everywhere from Katrina and how it affected the Gulf South to how it's affecting our communities in Puerto Rico. In New York City, where I run the UPROS, we have the first Climate Justice Center. It's a block-to-block organizing effort to basically train our community to become climate adaptable and to put just transition interventions in the hands of folks that are affordable and accessible. Everything from looking at community-owned solar, our communities owning utilities, to offshore wind on a grander scale, but looking both locally on a very specific block-to-block effort, so a community-wide effort to how we address regional issues and how we connect also the needs of urban communities to those of rural communities, so we are not pitted against each other and we are supporting each other's survival by building and strengthening those connections. So those are things that are happening in Brooklyn. while we were addressing the issue of climate change in New York City, and as a Climate Justice Alliance, really thinking about what a just recovery looks like for our people in Houston after they were hit by Harvey, Puerto Rico was hit by Hurricane Maria. As a Puerto Rican, as someone who's a climate justice activist and is Puerto Rican, I think my reaction was the same that the Puerto Rican diaspora all over the United States had, which was a gasp, really thinking about what happens to a nation that has had a legacy of extraction and austerity in the face of climate change. What happens to an island that really is colonized, where more than 50% of the population was unemployed, and now was hit by this hurricane, a country where there were 23 Superfunds that literally exploded into the lungs and into the sand, into the soil and into the air. What does that mean for Puerto Rico? So we launched the Climate Justice Alliance together with the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, Grassroots International, non-traditional partners like Greenpeace came together to launch the Our Power PR campaign. We were able to have actions in 4 cities, deliver 12,000 signatures to Congress. We had 5 brigades that went into Puerto Rico. The last one actually went into St. Croix, too, to see how we share, how we move away from an extractive system that makes us depend on food coming from the United States to providing the kinds of agroecological systems that help people survive. And so that work then also gave birth to Our Power PR NYC in New York City, where we have over 200 members and over 30 organizations working on a Puerto Rican diaspora response about transforming how we respond to climate change and support Puerto Ricans taking charge of their own recovery. We have been making demands of elected officials to respect Puerto Rican self-determination and sovereignty. And for us, fighting for a just recovery and just transitions led for Puerto Ricans means that, for example, companies like Tesla can't come into Puerto Rico to determine what an energy infrastructure looks like for us. A just recovery means long-term community-led solutions and fighting disaster capitalism. And while a company like Tesla may seem like the solution, for us it feels like in a nation that's been colonized like disaster capitalism. Just recovery also means that we have to focus on community control of land, community control of energy, manufacturing of renewable energy, and provide direct benefits to Puerto Rican workers. Union jobs and workers training must be a part of the recovery package. And then finally, Our Power PR NYC in New York City supports a just transition, which is about reclaiming the power of our traditional knowledge and preparing local livable communities that will survive the next weather event. And we know that we are now, while there are still 500,000 Puerto Ricans in the dark on the island, that we are now in hurricane season. And so I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. It's complicated, but the future is here now. It's going to affect the people least responsible for creating climate change. The communities all over the United States that are part of the Climate Justice Alliance have the solutions, and we urge you to invest in those community-led solutions, because by 2042, we will be the majority in this country at the same time as climate change will have had full hold of this country. And if those tools and those resources aren't in the hands of our community right now, we will not be ready for a future that can be pretty devastating. So gracias. We have with us today, the next speaker is Antonio Toval from the Farm Workers Association of Florida. Antonio.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Antonio Tovar, like you already introduced me. I'm very happy to be in here. It's an honor for me to share this presentation. And well, basically, I'm medical anthropology by formation. That's my background, and I've been in the Farm Worker Association for 12 years. And basically, the Farm Worker Association of Florida is working with farm workers because farm workers are a very vulnerable population, and like Elizabeth was saying correctly, like these populations of basically any disaster, the people that is more affected is people that is already in vulnerable situation. And farm workers are in vulnerable situation for many issues. First, it's one of the more risky occupations in the United States, have the highest rate of deaths, of the mortalities, and also injuries in the work. but they are also vulnerable because most of them are undocumented. And when this population is undocumented, they do not report the injuries or the accidents, but also they are not able to receive some of the benefits that other populations might be able to receive. They do not qualify for support from FEMA, and that's something that keeps them at risk. Now, they also live in substandard conditions. Their housings are not in good conditions. So when a storm hits, they usually are suffering for these disasters because they don't have, their houses are damaged. They also are unable to work because in rural communities, the harvest might be lost and the growers might receive some compensation for the loss of their harvest, for the loss of what is in the fields, but farm workers do not receive any compensations. They are actually at the expense of the support of the community that might be able to help them in a situation of disasters. And they will not qualify for compensation for the loss of their housing or other kind of support. And they are also in disadvantage because they do not have access to healthcare easily. The same condition of undocumented workers, they are afraid to go to the doctor. They will not access the healthcare and do not qualify for the Affordable Care Act, for example. So they are already at vulnerable situation. Now, the Farm Worker Association is interesting, but most of the offices, if you see the map to the right, there is 5 offices at the Farm Worker Association, and 4 of those offices, they have the little stars. 4 of those offices are in the coastal line. And this is not random because all these offices were born by disasters. For instance, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida, and the same happened. The communities were displaced, they lost their houses. There is a picture there where you can see all the disasters that happened in Florida City. Most of the workers lost not just employment, but they lost their housing, and they like the same condition happened. They were not receiving support. So the Farm Worker Association actually went to these places and they were supporting the communities because FEMA was not giving any support to these communities. And more recently in Florida City, the last picture is about Irma that also passed the Florida, and it destroyed especially the community of Immokalee and also the area around Immokalee, other small communities. But also in Homestead, what it caused, it was the loss of the crop. Again, some of the growers were receiving some compensations for the loss, but the farm workers were not receiving any support. Now, we know that agriculture is one of the problems in terms of how agriculture is being done. Industrial agriculture contributes to global warming at least 25%, or at least close to a quarter of the problem on global warming comes from the way that we produce food. So in 2016, in the United States, we were among the 5 top hottest days on record for 122 years. And also some states actually were at the top. They broke record on 2016. So we know that the same way that agriculture is one problem, we believe, at least the Farmers Association is firmly concerned, or firmly believes that they can be part of the solution. We have many actions in terms of hurricanes. Like we were suing FEMA in some years ago because precisely they were not giving support to these communities. This suit lasted for some years. We lost, unfortunately, but it's something that we have been concerned. We have been studying also the loss of wages for farm workers in these communities, and there is little that we have done. We have some support from other groups, like there were students from Emory University that we are doing some research on heat stress. Heat is also a long-term problem for farm workers because they are working in this hot environment. So they are more affected. There's some signs that have shown that workers in Central America and in other areas of the planet, they are suffering from kidney disease because heat. And that's something that it's a problem that we might be facing in the United States as well, because like we saw in 2016, it's one of the hottest times in the nation, and farm workers and other workers that are working in the heat might be at risk of suffering. So we are doing studies in terms of how much the workers are affected by the heat. And the purpose of these studies is not just to improve the workers or the knowledge of the workers on the risk that they are having in the heat, but also to create policies that might protect workers on the field. Right now, there's only 3 states in the United States that have regulations for heat stress. This is California, Washington State, and Minnesota. But this is a problem that it's national-wide, and we want to change that pattern. Agroecology is the other part of the work that the Farm Work Association is doing. And the first picture is actually the second encounter of agroecology that happened just 2 weeks ago. And this is a process that we believe, like I said, can change the paradigm of how we produce food. We believe that how we are doing it is unsustainable. So we are promoting the agroecology system as a way to improve how we produce food. Now, this is something that is going to be very challenged because obviously something of the argument is that we won't be able to produce enough food. We think that actually we are able to produce enough food if we can prove that this is true. The agroecology system promote a more diverse system and also a production of food that comes from the bottom up. Farm workers, paradoxically, although they produce the food, they don't have access to healthy food. They are lacking this access to food because many times they are working in monocrop systems, so they are not able to eat just oranges or tobacco that is not actually for food consumption. So they are at more vulnerable situation. And basically, we have other actions in terms of how to prepare the workers for disasters because we know that it's going to happen again. So the best way to do it is to inform the workers in terms of how to prepare better, and also to promote this system that it's more sustainable than the way that we are doing it right now. And with that, I will conclude, and I will introduce our next speaker, Joisha Duda, from Another Gulf is Possible, Collaborate, and Working Films. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, thank you to Climate Justice Alliance for hosting this and listening to our stories. So I guess first slide. I'm part of Another Gulf is Possible collaborative, which is an emerging collaborative of 6 brown women across the Gulf Coast. It's an emerging collaborative that's built on many years of relationships and kind of the ecosystem of organizing that exists across the Gulf Coast. So really wanting to emphasize, you know, while this is something new, it's built on something old and deep based on lots of experience of dealing with climate disasters and broadening the frame of what we mean by climate disaster. And I need the next slide because this is not working. So, you know, our Gulf South, we suffer from hurricanes, oil disasters, floods. We have issues of police brutality. We have in Louisiana the highest mass incarceration rate in the world. We have education debt. We have public health epidemics. We have mass, you know, deportations and issues with the border wall in Texas. And so, you know, the heart of our work is acting as one united front to combat the extraction of labor, land, and water that we feel is the heart of these ills and has
and Elizabeth illustrated, we believe all of this is connected through the lens of just transition. And so, next slide. And so through this work, we are moving ourselves away from an extractive economy that's based on the historical oppression of folks of color, based on stealing of land and labor and the genocide that's the founding of this country, right? So we believe in building an intersectional movement that connects economic, environmental, social, racial, educational, and transformative justice. And so we launched another Gulf is Possible collaborative for just transition, again, based on much work that has happened over the last decades. Next slide. And again, there's 6 of us. We span from Texas, Brownsville, Texas, Becca Hinojosa, and then moving across Louisiana. Cherie is in central Louisiana. Myself and Monique Bernan are both in New Orleans area. Judith is in Houston and also spending more time in New Orleans, and Mary Gutierrez is in Pensacola, Florida. So combined, we go from Brownsville, Texas to Pensacola. Next slide. And so just to hone in on Louisiana a little bit and give you some context of where I live and the place I call home, this is a map from, I believe, 1830 something, and you see this familiar shape of Louisiana, the familiar shape of the boot, this land that has been created by the moving of the river back and forth over thousands of years. As colonization happened and the damming of the river and creating of levee systems, we have created a crisis for ourselves. With the increased oil and gas infrastructure, this is a map of the oil and gas pipelines. This is a few years old, so there's many, many more pipelines now. Next slide. This is a map of the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which is a shipping canal that increased the amount of saltwater intrusion that has been killing our wetlands, which is our first line of defense, to increasingly strong storms and hurricanes. All this infrastructure is actually accelerating what is actually already happening with coastal land loss and also degradation of our wetlands. Next slide. This is another map of another view of the pipelines, many, 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 many pipelines that exist underneath our waters and our lands. Next slide. And this is a map of the BP oil disaster. So in addition to the wetlands, going away, coastal land loss, and the, increasing sea level rise, sinking of the land, we also have these kinds of ginormous disasters from the oil and gas industry. Okay. And finally, we also are seeing land loss at one of the greatest rates in the world. The only other place that we're seeing as rapid a land loss are places like my ancestral homeland of Bangladesh. So the red is where we're losing land. And next slide, does it like me? Yeah. And this slide, where you see the gray is actually where we have land. So, for many folks, that familiar shape of the boot of Louisiana is no longer. We actually, it would look very different if we drew the map the way it actually looks today. And so, looking at all of this as climate disaster, people's homes are going into the sea. The storms are coming. It's not a question of if, it's the question of when and where and how strong these storms are going to affect us. Next slide. And so this is a map of, I believe, 20 years of major hurricanes. And as we can see, it goes through the places that the people at this table call home. And we see the patterns. We know that this is something that is not going to go away anytime soon. Next slide. And so last year, Juan and myself and many folks have been working together. We started, when we heard Harvey was coming, we got on daily conference calls, I believe like 2 or 3 days before the hurricane hit. I live in New Orleans, and it's like, what can I do from afar? And people were like, well, we need somewhere to put some, aggregate the things that are happening, and particularly we want to make sure that people who want to donate money, that it went to places like Tejas and places that were actually going to get funds directly to the people and not to the Red Cross. So next slide. So we just started, where to donate money. We put in places for outsiders to be able to identify where they could responsibly put their money. We also aggregated resources for people on the ground, for people who were able to access the internet, you know, these different kinds of immediate response systems that were existing, not government-based, but people-to-people-based. We aggregated some resources that were, you know, kind of sprouting up just to place all these things into one kind of list. And somehow this web page went viral, and we saw basically within 24 hours, it went all across the world. And, you know, just even for Tejas alone, I think it was something like 60,000 hits to Tejas's, like people were clicking from this site to Tejas. And so, you know, this was something that didn't take, there was no resources, there was no, it was just something that we felt like we needed to do. There was no grant to do it. We didn't get any money from doing it, but it felt like something that was a need. And so we did what we needed to do. And those are the kinds of proactive measures we feel like we are compelled in this moment to provide, because we do have the solutions. And those solutions are the solutions that we need to be investing in instead of the false solutions. And so I'll end with a little animatic that is super in development. This is super draft form, but just to give a picture of the vision that we have for our Gulf.
Like that.
Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Juan Parras, and I'm the director of Texas Environmental Justice Advocacy Services. And we are located in Houston, Texas. That's what we like to refer to Houston as. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad the Campaign for, Climate Justice Alliance invited us to make a presentation. I would like to start out with a 2-minute video. It's actually a 10-minute video, but we have cut it down to 2 minutes. Okay.
they're not hearing
Yeah.
the audio. All right. You can just talk and say, we'll fix the audio in a second.
Yeah, okay, the audio's been worked on, folks. That's what happens when you have, I guess, videos of the index. They cut you off. Or right back on or what?
I'm just gonna put it here for 1 second.
And known to better use. But we're still.
They did hear the last one. Can he go on while you're fixing it? Can you start your presentation and we'll try to...
Can we go to the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay. We're gonna go ahead and move on, folks. Let's see if we can get the PowerPoint. Okay, well, here it is. The reason we had the video first is because we wanted you to clearly and visibly see where Manchester is and the industry that surrounds Manchester. And then when you see that, then you'll be shocked that a community actually lives in the middle of all that industry. And when you think about the environmental justice movement, even though it's a fairly new movement, and we talk about the legacy of EJ issues, you wonder why a community like Manchester basically has not been relocated or has not been offered relocation or has been bought out by the industry. And in fact, just recently, the Valero company or the Valero refinery purchased 10 more city blocks to encroach on that community. And it's going to make it worse for them because instead of relocating the community with money that are available, they haven't done that, either Valero or the city of Houston. And the reason I say that is because in 2014, the city of Houston gave the Valero industry of the refinery an $18 million tax break. That $18 million, when we asked Valero, to help us relocate communities, they say it's too costly. But yet they're willing to take $18 million in tax breaks from the city of Houston that could have, in our opinion, been used to relocate the community. Additionally, that was in 2014. In 2017, the city of Houston sold the Valero refinery 10 city blocks so that they can expand. And the reason that, they bought the 10 city blocks for $1.4 million in 2017. And remember, we gave them a tax break of $18 million in 2014. So it just doesn't add up, Instead of helping out the communities, what they're doing is they're heavily investing in Valero and other industries along the Houston Ship Channel. So we think that's an insult to communities and actually a disgrace to city elected officials and representatives that make those decisions. Additionally, we have our state regulators, our Texas Commission on Environmental Quality is very lax on enforcing the rules of environmental issues. And in fact, we have in the city of Houston, what they call self-reporting, where the industry reports their emissions voluntarily. And so it's hard to regulate. We know, the state knows what's been admitted, but they're self-reporting. In a lot of cases, they overestimate and then underestimate, and I'll show you a graphic showing that. Anyway, look, we'll go here to Hurricane Harvey because we got the screen up here. But in a very short time, we had 1.2 trillion gallons of rainfall on Harris County. That's a lot of water. Harvey was one in a 1,000-year weather event. That means it doesn't happen often, right? It impacted more than 6 million people in the Houston area. Nearly 20,000 Estonians were housed in shelters. And this is not housed in shelters locally. A lot of them had to actually be shipped out of the city of Houston to other places that had shelter available. That reminds me of when Hurricane Katrina hit in New Orleans. 250,000 people were displaced, and about nearly 60 to 50,000 relocated to the city of Houston, and they were housed in the Astrodome, the old Astrodome. And of those 60 to 50,000 that came for shelter in the city of Houston, we still have about 35,000 that just they didn't have a place to go. They couldn't go back to New Orleans. So anyway, that's probably going to happen to those nearly 20,000 Houstonians that were relocated. They may not come back because of the absence of shelter. We have a coalition. We call ourselves the EJ Environmental Justice Coalition. And that includes the communities of Manchester, the 5th Ward, Pasadena, and Pleasantville. Next slide, please. No, here it is.
Didn't like me.
You don't like me? Okay. So if you look at the map now, we have a map. We'll show you where 5th Ward is. 5th Ward and Pleasantville are predominantly African-American communities. Manchester is Latino, and then Pasadena is a mix of Latino and others. So those are the communities that we're trying to form we formed the coalition, and we want to expand those coalitions all the way to Galveston and Texas City. Next slide. Immediately right after hurricane, and we started receiving funds and donations, as Jaisha said, they put up a website and they asked for donations to be given to various groups. So we started with those funds that we were getting, we started to do re-entry kits, and you see a picture of what's on there: Clorox, gloves, basically cleaning supplies, because that's the most immediate things that people needed: cleaning supplies. And then obviously the next thing we have on there is two-share. What that is the second phase of what took after the cleaning supplies were used up, is that you have to rebuild. So we were able to purchase tools like generators and not stoves, but shovels, rakes, anything that could be used in either tearing down a facility or rebuilding, hammers and whatnot. Next slide. This is a picture that Yvette took about the Clayton Homes. Clayton Homes is a federally subsidized housing, and you can see the water reached up to the 5 floors, and in the background you'll see, not 5 floors, 5 feet, right? But anyway, this young man had 2 wheelchairs, electrical wheelchairs, and they were all underwater, so he couldn't even get out. He actually was rescued by residents that came in and got him out. And this is just one example of all the flooding and extreme flooding that we had in the city of Houston. Primarily the flooding, though, occurred in what we call the privileged communities, the west side. They were really inundated with floodwaters. We had flooding in our communities, but not as severely as the west side of town. In our communities, we were also what we call the second storm or the second flood. And the second storm and the second flood, if you combine them, is that we were inundated with air toxins, chemicals of all types. That was our flood, in addition to, water floods. And the Arkema plant is an example of a plant that exploded during the floods. And when we think about the explosion that could have occurred along the Houston Ship Channel, we have to talk about chemical security policy. Because if chemical security policy had been in place and had been addressed, we think that maybe we could have prevented the Arkema plant from actually exploding. But nonetheless, the chemical security plan, and I'll be very brief how important it is to us. Right after 9/11, the Attorney General for the Southern District of Texas spoke at Texas Southern University, and his discussion was about what the Department of Homeland Security was doing to address chemical security, it wasn't called chemical security at that time, but disasters, okay? And he says, right after 9/11, and he raises his hand up and says, right after 9/11, we send out a list to all the major cities in the United States. And he says, and this is a long list of what we consider to be potential terrorist targets. And he says, and guess what? He says, Houston is the only major city in the nation that identified everything on this list. So this is after 9/11, 6 months after 9/11. And I dare say that we're still in the same situation, that when we talk about just the thought of being, terrorized or attacked in the city of Houston, we have every target they would be looking for. So we're still trying to push the politicians and all those that we can to address those issues. Chemical security is a policy that could be addressed and needs to be addressed, at least for the sake of, communities like Manchester, other communities along the Greater Houston Ship Channel. But we need to have the political will. And currently, under the Trump administration, he has delayed that policy. And we think it's something that should have been moved forward quickly and not delayed another 20 months. Now, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm glad to be here. If there's any questions or any ideas that you want to send us, email us, farras.juan@gmail.com. Thank you. Appreciate it. The next person in line. Is it Jose? Is it Jose? But he's absent, right?
Do you want me to try this? Do you want to try to show the video?
Yes, I'll take an additional 2 minutes. Thank you.
Go ahead and show the video. It would be good to see. So the people can relate to Manchester and then come up and rescue us, okay?
Still coming out through there, and I told him not to get off the link, so if people want to see later.
Unless we can offer to see it later.
Yeah. Sure, we can send
Yeah.
the link.
Can we
Send
do
the
that?
link,
That way
yeah.
we don't waste any time.
Okay.
Yeah, the link into the
Go ahead, Jose.
Good morning, everyone. It's still 9:46 over here in California, so it is morning for us. My name is Jose Bravo. I'm the Executive Director to the Just Transition Alliance. And we're going to show also a short video. Hopefully we can see some of the or hear some of the audio on that. So we'll start off with the video as well.
While we were here, the government decided to privatize the energy system. So what privatization means for people here in Puerto Rico is that what they pay for energy is going to go up, because now a company from the United States will be making money on what's happening here in Puerto Rico.
First is the privatization of electricity. Then from there, we see the privatization of water.
They can hear.
Then we see the privatization of schools and institutions. So what's the impact of that privatization, both on workers participating in the decision-making process about their future and their destiny, but at the same time, then the elimination of trade unions, right to work in the United States, the national campaign around right to work, and how that's getting played out in many of our communities. We need to be able to build the relationships between workers, between farmers, those in the countryside and so on, and then the grassroots organizations or the NGOs here.
We've met with presidents of unions from throughout the island that represent hundreds of thousands of people. And one of the things that they tell us is that ultimately privatization is going to hurt the workers, it's going to hurt community, and it's going to hurt the environment. So we have to take this back to the United States and help in some way get this message out that privatization is not the way to go.
Any of the issues in Puerto Rico need to be driven, and we're very well aware of that, driven by what we call the bottom-up process. And that to us means that the issues and the solutions to bring about after the recent hurricane, that needs to be driven by folks in Puerto Rico and not driven by organizations in the United States.
The Just Transition Alliance was formed with a relationship with unions and environmental justice communities in the United States. So that's what our primary focus was here too, is to bring unions to the table, to have those dialogues with the communities, to help out in whichever way they can. And ultimately, what we've seen here in Puerto Rico is that what affects people on the job affects people in the community. And we see that. And one of the pieces that we really want to make sure people understand is that there can't be an environmental justice movement, there can't be a just transition without those workers that are in harm's way as well. We are seeing a mass exodus also of people here from the island of Puerto Rico, and the same thing happened in Katrina. So now what we want to go back and do is we want to bring some of the community folk from New Orleans, from Louisiana here so that they can talk with the people here in Puerto Rico, so that they can tell them exactly how the disaster capitalists have ruined a lot of the livelihoods back in Louisiana.
Well, today we're going to focus on labor response in Puerto Rico. And many of you saw during, right after Maria, that a lot of labor unions had sent workers into Puerto Rico to help out with some emergency response. That was all put together by the AFL-CIO in Washington, D.C., along with one of the persons on the video, Lole, who's the representative to this AFL-CIO for Puerto Rico. And part of the way that they did that was that they went to all the municipalities and talked to them and asked them to fill out job sheets on urgent, critical needs. So in many instances, doctors, nurses, people that were able to drive heavy machinery were brought in. There was also an agreement with American Airlines to fly people in there and fly equipment in there. And that was an agreement by the AFL-CIO here in the United States, and Lole coordinating that whole process in Puerto Rico. So again, the emergency response piece that was put together was very successful. And, you know, now we'll move on to the government response. So the government response to the urgency in Puerto Rico, as many of you saw, was, again, borderline racist or racist. And at the same time, it was just a big PR piece, public relations piece to kind of let the people know in the United States that something's being done. And, you know, but the government response in Puerto Rico it was more of a Band-Aid approach, because over 50,000 light poles came down on the island of Puerto Rico. And additionally, of the 600 main power towers, the big towers, of the 600, about almost 300 of those were either destroyed or damaged severely. And then, you know, the response from the government was send in Whitefish, send in 3 people to try to deal with this whole situation there in Puerto Rico. A lot of what the workers were talking to us about were the privatization, right? And they made it very tangible. They said, look, you privatize the electrical system in Puerto Rico, and hospitals that get subsidized energy will have to start paying for energy. As a result, those people going to those hospitals will also have to pay higher consultation fees to get treated. So you know, and again, that money would come to a U.S. corporation that in essence would own the electrical system in Puerto Rico. I want to mention that you know, we learned a lot from our brothers and sisters in the labor movement in Puerto Rico. Yes, they do want to have a visit here to the United States to see how other people responded to Katrina, to Harvey, to others, and see what that resistance looks like in the United States around privatization. For them, their biggest threat right now is privatization and the fact that they will lose those jobs. And at that point, there'll be more damage caused by hurricanes. In this case, these hurricanes. The other piece that they agreed to do was that they want to keep on ongoing work with communities in Puerto Rico and help shore up some very specific communities. They don't have the bandwidth to do the whole island, but they wanted to earmark a couple, 2 or 3 communities where they can come in and help to shore them up. There was several examples of a couple of buildings and communities that were working on disaster preparedness. And some of those communities received very little to hardly any damage. And inside those buildings and those housing units. So that's one of the models that they want to help with. And there's community organizations that are willing to do that. And lastly, one of the things that is really important, and I'm sure others will speak to this, is that there's an intentional food scarcity happening in Puerto Rico, right? To drive prices up. And Puerto Rico is very dependent on the United States, the mainland, to supply a lot of food. And we see those types of models of exploitation of communities here in the United States, where intentionally organizations are seeing more and more that communities are food deprived. Grocery stores are not available. Good food is not available. So those models of exploitation are very apparent also in Puerto Rico, and those are the models that the corporations are importing. I will leave it there with that comment. I would like to thank the Climate Justice Alliance for having us on this. And also I wanted to say that you all got a first glimpse of that video that we put together along with the Climate Justice Alliance. And we're gonna come public with that pretty soon, hopefully this week. But it's a 23-minute video where you can see, hear, and you can get an idea of some of the important work that's going on the island. Thank you all very much.
All right. So, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Katia Avilés. I'm with Organización Boricua de Agricultura Ecológica, and I will be giving a presentation that's coming up really soon. And let's see if it works. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you a little bit of a background, some lessons learned, and give you a glimpse of the situation and try to connect everyone. We've all been talking about the same issue, which is how climate has affected the Caribbean and Gulf communities, but also our marginalized communities in some ways, and what are some potential next steps. At this rate, we might not be able to finish. Boricua is a 28-year-old peasant farm worker organization that works on food sovereignty specifically and organizes a network of different agroecological farms within Puerto Rico. Our mission is to promote food sovereignty and environmental justice within the islands. And within these communities, we practice what we call campesino, which is sharing knowledge between the farmers and farming practitioners. So to give you, okay. Yeah, this is, so those of you that don't know, Maria was a pretty intense hurricane, and it actually ripped through the entire island. This is just the trajectoria, the path of the eye within the island. It engulfed, it covered all of the archipelago and hit us all. What's really important about this is to note the impact that it had within our landscape. And I'm just gonna go really quick through these pictures and images, going through the different farms. And part of the work that had been done, this was work of years between the farmers that was just gone in the blink of an eye. And yeah, this is not working properly, unfortunately. So I don't know if maybe I can stretch out so to give you an idea, this is the vulnerability index for Puerto Rico. And you can see the darkest area are the highest vulnerability areas. That corresponds almost completely with the rural area in Puerto Rico. If you go to the next one, however, you're gonna see, if you go to the next one, please, however, you're gonna see that the largest documented damage in terms of housing lost was metro areas that are Ponce and San Juan in the north and south. But when you do the proportion of damages, and that's the next image, you see that different areas light up. Precisely the rural area lights up because even though there were less houses in the area, those houses were heavily impacted by the hurricane. Next slide, please. And just to talk a little bit about that, we still have thousands of people without electricity. We still don't have access to water. It's clean water in many areas. There's still a heavy military presence. 80 to 90% of our agricultural activity was completely gone. There's still deaths and desaparecidos are still being counted. We have an environmental policy hazard zones that are being just completely waived, increased migration like Jose Bravo just mentioned, and highlight that this disaster was not natural. Most of the issues with the disaster was because of the reaction, both from the federal and the local government. And what we did after the hurricane, but also something that had been happening with Boricua before the hurricane, and that we had been working precisely with FLAF and the Climate Justice Alliance, was to work through brigades, connecting people in the different communities, sharing knowledge. And this is just a list of some of the brigades that we did right after the hurricane, just barely clearing out the streets within less than 2 weeks to get out and see how people were doing. Because the first thing we needed to assess is who's alive and what's needed immediately. We created what we call support centers or centros de apoyo mutuo. And in these centers, we were able not only to organize ourselves and heal, but also connect with other organizations and distribute resources. In this particular area, Boricua became a constant coordinator of different brigades to do immediate help, water, food, because that was the first thing that wasn't available, but then also to start reconstructing. This is just some images that I'm going to run through of what we were doing in this support centers, sharing knowledge. This was at the end of every day, assessing what we saw, and different people were working in different areas. There were feminist groups in this support center. There were also from public housing projects. Public housing was completely abandoned, the same as farming, and distributing eco kits, distributing seeds, distributing energy sources. Like I mentioned, canned foods, because you cannot preserve anything. There was no fridges, clean water, organizing seeds so that people had things that could bloom, could be reaped quickly, going house by house. This particular house, just to give you an idea of the impact that energy issues had, this is the daughter. The mom was in the bed next to it, and she ate through a machine. She had been without food for 2 weeks when we arrived. This is kind of trying to provide some kind of mitigation and electricity for everyone, and then the federal government and the local government response. So in this case, I think it's important to highlight that while we had a huge impact, thank you, we still have not received an appropriate amount of what's supposed to be brought to the island according to the damage that we had. In this case, for example, FEMA has defaulted to denying all claims and only actually evaluating the claims if you appeal. And on the other hand, the amount that we receive is much lower per person, has been much lower than in other communities. Many issues are related to this, and this goes to what is appropriate for the US is not necessarily appropriate for a Caribbean island, which is in this particular case that we have a lot of our properties and homes are not formally documented. I personally lost all my documents, so I can't evidence that I had at some point anything. And you need all those papers to make a claim to FEMA. So we end up not having a way to reconstruct our homes and our property. So our work is actually even more intense than it should be. And this is just to highlight a little bit of what both Elizabeth and Jose talked about, which is contrast the response that the government had to the response that we as the people had. While the government centralized and grabbed and increased bureaucracy, imposing new methods of doing work, we actually worked on decentralizing and opening spaces, doing daily brigades all over the different towns and communities, making sure that people heard the truth, different ways to support. And the actual CJA at some point, it was really, really interesting because we had been starting to get phone calls from people in CJA after Irma. And it was a little bit strange because for us, Irma was like, oh, well, this is another hurricane. We've done this before, we know this song and dance. It weakened us. We had a week without water after Irma and a week without power. Some of us had about 6 days with power back on before Maria hit. And to this day, still without power and water in some areas. So I think it's really important to know that it was because CJA had been already kind of pushing us to, hey, think about this, that we had started to organize on how we were gonna do this, collect funds and distribute the information and the knowledge. So we went out to do the brigades. So the brigades were generally up to 20 people. And this is just a list of some of the brigades that we were able to support. And this was all thanks to the people that helped out through CJA, through Boricua, and going to do direct support, whether it was food or actual work at the farms. And just to give you an idea, this was getting food to a farm. So the river wasn't like that before. You could actually get to the community, and we had to do human chains to do that. Opening access to the farm access was completely cut off in many ways. And thank you. And to start farming again emotionally, once you've planned your life for 20 years and you know the farm like the back of your hand, having to look at everything gone down to the earth, it's very intense. So one of these brigades, the farmer had not been able to go out, and we were able to go out, and this was the result of 1 day of work helping this farmer. Supporting urban farms and getting food to people. We were eating, and I always joke, we were eating sausages and stale bread for months. Not the healthiest diet in the world. So supporting farms became critical to support the health and the integrity of our communities. And La Perla and PDT were two of the brigades that we worked with. We also, thanks to CJA and the Food Sovereignty Alliance and other groups, we were able to connect with press while our governor was saying that only 16 people had died. And we knew there were hundreds of people had to even bury some in their backyard. This is the way that we were able to get the information out. We were able to make international connections. In this case, Dalma, who's a teacher in Orocovis, got to talk to Naomi Klein during this interview here. And we were able to actually exchange with each other. And this is something that I stress every single time I give this presentation. When this hit, one of the main things is that we are US citizens when it comes to paying all the taxes and doing all the regulations and not being able to travel to Cuba or the Dominican Republic or Mexico when we want, or even receiving aid from Cuba or Mexico that offered to help us put back the electric. So thanks to international support, we were able to send people after the hurricane to different countries and to different areas to learn and exchange knowledge and talk about what we had been through. So it became a healing process for us, but also a learning two-way process to bring other things. For example, in Cuba had just passed Irma. So how did Cuba manage Irma from the perspective of farming and electricity? And this is just an example of when climate justice had a huge brigade in Puerto Rico, an international brigade. We had people from Nicaragua, Canada, the US, and then we moved on to San Croix to continue the work because the entire Caribbean is suffering, and we need to make sure that we connect throughout the Caribbean as one area. Even though the islands of Puerto Rico or of Dominican Republic are not going to be necessarily sustainable when it comes to food, the Caribbean region was sustainable. And that's really important because we were able to trade with each other, talk to each other, and learn from each other, which is something that the relationship with the US does not afford us to do right now. And that's the reason that funding from other sources than the federal government comes in is so important. So in the short term, we had direct support, short term to midterm, reworking, reconstructing, rebuilding homes and farms. And we also worked with other groups, raising money so that we could do some supplementary income for a lot of farmers. And now in the long term, how do we make sure that our communities face what's coming? Because the next seasons are going to be just equally hard on us, and particularly as climate seasons change. Right now we're getting 10 months of drought and then 2 months of really, really heavy rain. So in this particular case, we need to make sure that we have access to capital, that we have access to administrative support, land resources, that we hook up with other political projects in the region, and that we focus on educational awareness. And these are all things that Boricua is working with other groups as well, focusing on getting these resources for the future. So right now, like I mentioned, working on finalizing or strengthening this network and making sure that we support, like Elizabeth stressed, local solutions. Just to give you a silly example, Zillow versus WhatsApp. WhatsApp is one we use in Puerto Rico because we have more Latin American connections. Zillow didn't work at all. But right before Irma and Maria, people were promoting Zillow and started installing it in their phones. But what would have worked or what worked was WhatsApp. So it's interesting because you have to know the region in order to be able to promote a solution. And just thank you for everything that has been achieved thanks to working together, and hopefully we can keep working together in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi y'all, I'm Allison Corwin, Senior Program Officer at the Cerna Foundation based in New York, here in Miami with all these beautiful people. Really humbled to be here. And so I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth and Antonio and Joisha and Juan and Jose and Katia and the whole Climate Justice Alliance crew. So we're a funding partner of CJA, and I'm always honored to sit around the table with folks. And so I have the privilege of bringing us through our question and answer period. So for all of you at your laptops and your desktops at home, please, we have questions streaming in, which I'm going to relay to our speakers. But please feel free to send those questions in. If we don't get to everything, hopefully we can answer those online and afterward. And for our folks in the room with us, if you have burning questions, please flag me down. I think what we'll do is we'll kick it off with a question that came in online while y'all were giving your beautiful presentations. And I'm always reminded every time I sit with y'all, really that local solutions, are where, as funders, speaking on behalf of the funding community, where we really need to focus our attention, and that local folks and those most impacted by an issue always know best and always have the solutions. And using that sort of as we enter any conversation to understand. I'm always reminded as I sit with y'all about that. So thank you for your beautiful presentations today. And the first question we have has a couple parts to it, so I'll read through it, and maybe if a piece of it moves you to answer, we'll sort of just go around the table and hear your thoughts. So here's the question. What efforts are underway to train residents in climate-threatened areas to respond to disasters? And some of y'all did touch on this. Would love to hear about not just training, but also in supporting migration as people are forced inland. As a follow-up, how does class, race, and gender play into this? Since folks with the most resources must be trained to follow the leadership of people of color, so how does that play into training and disaster planning? So anyone who has a burning first thought and wants to reply to any part of that question? You want to go for it, Elizabeth?
Sure. I don't know if it's burning, simmering. So my response was that I don't know if it's burning, it's definitely simmering. There are efforts to train residents all over the United States and in Puerto Rico. There are folks that are training people on food sovereignty, on just transitions, on how to create cooperatives, land trusts. All of those things are happening all over the country. They're certainly happening in Brooklyn and the Bronx. They're happening in Detroit. They're happening in Richmond. They're happening in New Orleans. I think that, and then the issue of class, race, and gender is central to all of the work that we do. In Puerto Rico, for example, a lot of the work is being led by women. The climate justice movement is predominantly led by women from frontline communities. Yesterday, I was meeting with a community here in Homestead, and all of the women, all the people doing the work were women. We think feminism is central to all of that. And then one of the challenges that we face is that there is this idea that that we need mediators or people who can come in with the solutions for us, that they can facilitate the solutions for us, that we're thought of in terms of outreach, but not in terms of leadership or in terms of transformation. And so the funding happens in a way that really supplants local leadership and doesn't support us. It turns our people, and I often say this, into passive recipients of somebody else's good intentions. I also think that there is less trust to put funding in the hands of the people that are most impacted to actually do the work. And so we've had to do a lot with very little resources because of that lack of trust. I don't know how that's going to be sustained over time with the increasing challenges to our survival, the change in climate change and the change in demographics. And I think that's a question for funders to ask themselves, why they would rather put the resources in the hands of folks that are not from our communities to determine for us what our priorities are than to put it in our hands. That's an internal question that the foundation world will have to ask, where that comes from and why that happens. We have our own beliefs and our own understanding about why that is in fact the case. But the training is happening, and we find often, and our organization is intergenerational, that the training is most effective when it's coming from the people most impacted, that people actually own it, they lead it, and they integrate also culture, arts, spirituality, and all of the things that make a whole community as part of the training. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think 2 points. One, I think training, yes, and I think investing in networks of mutual support in terms of this people-to-people infrastructure that we need to develop and we need to maintain for the long haul. I think what Elizabeth's speaking to in terms of lack of trust in frontline communities from funders, I also think that lack of trust and that lack of resourcing has led to fracturing within our movement because there's this disaster philanthropy, kind of bring a bunch of resources for Katrina during BP, and then those resources get taken away. And it further erodes trust within the community because that competitive kind of capitalist urge that exists it's human. Like, I need to look out for my people, but we need to look out for our people. And so how can funders really help long-term investment in mutual networks of support, which we know we need, because it's not, again, a question of if, it's a question of where, when, and how severe these storms are going to be. And so this bringing resources, taking it away, bringing resources, taking it away, that yo-yo effect harms our communities and harms our ability to respond when in times of crisis and disaster. So I really want to hit on the issue of trust and deepening, the existing relationships, the existing networks that we already have, and how to help support those of us who are really trying to figure out what are the solutions that we know we have, and try to, mobilize for that. And then the other thing about migration, and not everybody wants to leave. And so I think there's a question about, supporting those who are feeling like they need to move because the water is coming, the water is rising, the storms are getting stronger. And there are people who are very clear they will not leave, and how they want to live on the water, with the water, we need to support those folks as well. So the answer is not only one case of relocation and migration. Yes, that is happening on Ile de Jean Charles, communities I live in, but there are also, you talk to the elders and they're not leaving. They're not going anywhere. So we need to have that conversation on both sides.
A few things that I would like to mention regarding funding and trust. There's actually a lot of money that is dedicated to park improvements, beautiful things that you want in your community. And it doesn't really target, in some cases, actually the individual families that need the help. It's holistic. It's not, concentrated in communities, for instance, like Manchester again. So I think that the foundation world has to figure out how to help those low-income communities that need help, and have the trust that they will use that money very, I don't want to say very concentrated in what they need, but they're not going to waste it, because, to them money is very valuable. Obviously, they need resources, but they will use it wisely. And we just have to, when I say we, Foundation will just have to give them the benefit of the doubt that they're not just gonna like splurge on that money and say, oh, we got this $1 million, now we can, run all over the world. That's not it. These communities are very conscious of the resources they get when they get resources, and they use them 100% towards their needs. Regarding, just the issue of, the kind of training that they need, most communities already know what they need in their community. They just don't have the resources to deal with it. So they make the best of it. Anybody want to comment?
Yeah, I also wanted to comment a little bit more around the training on preparedness. I agree with Elizabeth and others that were saying that, there's that knowledge within the community, and it has to be community driven. It can't be coming from other folks, coming from the outside to try to figure out what's best for those communities. And to that, there's a group there, I'm going to say 2025, that has been doing some of that shoring up. And they've spent about $57 per household to shore up a lot of those households. That's a very, very cheap price to keep folks safe during some of these catastrophes. And the community where they worked before and some of the housing that they did for shoring up, sustained very little damage. Now they want to amplify this to 300 households in that community, and then they want to put together a program where they train community members to do the work themselves and then pass that knowledge on. So, that's very important. Those are very important things to also to help. So just wanted to give you that example of some of that work that's going on.
Hi, everybody. Want to thank everyone for their amazing presentation. I'm Cindy Weissner with Grassroots Global Justice and the Climate Justice Alliance. And one of the things that folks talked about was this broader campaign, which is the Our Power Communities campaign. But one of the things that folks can actually talk about a little bit more is the just recovery model was so powerful because of the people-to-people work that happened and the exchange that happened and the solidarity that was shown. But also, if you can talk about the Our Power Puerto Rico campaign and how you're centering the people impacted, but also how you're setting terms with how to organize with other environmental groups, racial justice groups, gender justice groups. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a question for me. So the people-to-people just recovery, the idea, particularly around Puerto Rico, which is really important, and I think that Katia might want to talk a little bit more about how you felt, someone who was in Puerto Rico, we're coming in from the United States. The idea of a just recovery really was based on the model of just transitions. We reached out to folks in Puerto Rico and we asked specifically, what is it that you need and what you want, and what can we do to support your leadership and to make sure that we are supporting the vision of the folks in Puerto Rico in this moment of crisis. And so there was also, as a Puerto Rican, I have to say that the idea of a just recovery was really also important to me because I was concerned about disaster capitalism. I was concerned about corporations in the United States and even nonprofits that were going into Puerto Rico with their own agenda and really exploiting the crisis in Puerto Rico. And then because of Puerto Rico's particular relationship with the United States, the idea that people could survive because there were people who were taking their back and supporting them was extremely important. And so it was also this message to the United States that you could have the shipping industry holding on to all of the goods and all of the supplies and not letting Puerto Ricans get access to resources from Cuba, from the Dominican Republic, from Mexico, from all of the places that wanted to provide support for Puerto Rico. But we will be able to do something that will provide us with the human infrastructure so that we can survive that. And that was really, really powerful. In terms of our relationships, when we decided to launch our Power PR October 11th, and we came together with a number of organizations, we reached out, for example, to Greenpeace. We wanted their ship. Actually wanted Greenpeace to violate the Jones Act. That's really what I wanted them to do. They did stuff for whales and got, they got they got arrested for stuff like that. And we wanted international attention on Puerto Rico because we didn't want Puerto Rico to become invisible. As we speak right now, it's been 7 months out. And we know that FEMA has been, instead of rebuilding, has been evacuating people. And that by 2019, we expect that 500,000 people will have been evacuated from Puerto Rico, might never come back. The feeling from the Puerto Rican diaspora is that the entire island is being evacuated to privatize the entire island. That's exactly what they're doing. The school system, the infrastructure, La Lancha in Vieques, where people on the island don't have access to food or water, and about 400 gentrifiers in the island of Vieques are having meetings without the Viequenses to talk about the future of Vieques. So the people-to-people recovery, I think, was created to provide people with the resources. So for example, people asked us for water filtration devices, and they asked us for solar generators instead of electric generators. That was really important because Puerto Ricans lead in the world on levels of asthma. So having diesel operated generators was actually making the air yellow, and the island was being populated by single serve water bottles that helps industries here in the United States, but weren't helping Puerto Ricans in terms of their waste problem. So we've been listening very carefully and really respecting and honoring the sovereignty of the people in Puerto Rico and providing them with support, and also understanding as part of, because we're movement builders, not institution builders, really understanding that those actually, that how Puerto Rico recovers and comes back from this becomes a lesson for the Global South on how you come back from disaster when you are the world's oldest colony. So there's been a lot of lessons there. I don't think I'm answering all of the points that Cindy raised, but I think those are the ones that, as someone who was born and raised in New York City, moved me. In New York City, the diaspora really created this Our Power PR NYC campaign so that we can support Puerto Rico in the long term. So we have an action, for example, this Thursday, because we had a community meeting in the Bronx last week that was wall-to-wall people, where we learned that the Puerto Ricans that have moved to New York City are now being kicked out of shelters with nowhere to go, that FEMA is basically pulling out their support. And while we were there in a community meeting to talk about how are we going to make sure that we're working strategically to support Puerto Rico for the next few years, there were a few families in the room that saying, tomorrow morning, I won't have a space to live with my child. And so the press conference on Thursday is for that. We have press conferences in Wall Street because Promesa, which is the oversight committee that has basically institutionalized austerity in Puerto Rico and extraction in Puerto Rico and disaster capitalism in Puerto Rico, meets in Wall Street in downtown Manhattan, and doesn't meet in Puerto Rico. So the diaspora plays a major role in making sure that it uses media and it uses our political leverage and our support in the United States to support the demands and the constraints that Puerto Ricans on the island are basically struggling to grow food and get clean water and do environmental remediation. Those of us in the United States play a very different kind of role. And that is one of the things that we consider a people-to-people just recovery. So, Tati, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure. I'm not sure if I'm as hopeful as Elizabeth that we'll be an example of recovery. I am actually pretty fearful, and I think I appreciate the question very much in terms of how we're connecting and how this is happening. I think one of the things that I would like to highlight is that the foundations in both at the U.S. level and in Puerto Rico, the large foundations, got together and they hoarded the same as the government did. And that's another part of why I'm really thankful for this alliance and the way that this alliance works, people to people type of situation, because there was literally, while people did not have clean water, there were foundations that bought out all the filters and kept them in a storage so they could take the credit for distributing those filters. At this point, we have two major foundation networks that have raised almost $80 million between the two of them. And that's just going to work based on who knows who and how you have those connections. So the people that don't get access to the internet application process of those foundations are not going to be able to access that money. So the support of people that know and trust the base and trust those grassroots organizing efforts are going to be the key to getting out of the mess that we're in right now. And I think it's really important to highlight that the mess that we're in right now is that one tree knocked down power for over 1 million people in Puerto Rico just this past week. That there's tarps, there's thousands and thousands of houses with tarps, and that's the only thing that they have a defense for when this next hurricane season comes, or the next strong wind, or the next storm comes along. And there's no way that a tarp's going to survive that. So our infrastructure is incredibly weakened. It's not going to be able to withstand the next season just because we have 2 months, and we need as much support as can be done, or whatever can be done, to get in gear and be as strong as we can be, knowing that we won't be where we need to be at. And just to highlight what Elizabeth was saying, the promesa and the fiscal plan that the board is proposing counts on the fact that people leave the island. The projections for population, particularly for children, are thousands less children, because the projections for migration, and they're doing everything in their power to guarantee that those projections become true. And knowing that you're going to be pushed out of where you're supposed to be living in, it's a very difficult feeling to deal with, while you're also healing with your family and seeing your mom go crazy and start hoarding food in April when the season starts in June. You know, that's just all part of what's going on, and how we connect. And I apologize, I'm just going to take one more second, but while we were working from those mutual support centers, there were feminist organizations, there were public housing groups, there was a farming group in an urban support center, and we got together and tried to support each other and strengthen each other as much as we could. For example, we had a farming brigade go to Yeques, and that farming brigade, we took advantage of that, and we were able to get a woman that had been a victim of domestic violence out and get her to safety. And that to us was crucial, that we were in those spaces together and making sure that we stayed in communication and connecting and strengthening those ties. And I think also learning from this alliance and the different, not everyone in the alliance has the same primary objective, but we share the core values that helped move forward and get people to safety or help people out. And to me, I think that highlights the importance of connecting the movement, because we do share those core values, because women tend to face the brunt of the issue, and then also the natural resources exploitation is very much reflected in our bodies. So I just wanted to add that, because I think it's important to understand.
Yes, I think we are on our wrap up now. And so, as we've heard today, we know who is hit first and worst in climate disaster. And again, thinking of climate disaster in a broad sense, yes, it means hurricanes and all that entails with a severe hurricane, but it also includes sea level rise. It includes the off-gassing in communities in Houston and Manchester. It includes all of these things that are climate disasters for our communities. And so, we're hearing in Puerto Rico and Houston and New Orleans, so much learning from each other and building with each other and supporting each other through this is what we need in this moment. Building solidarity across these places that we know we will be continuing to suffer from these catastrophic events until we get our act together and reverse climate change, I think can happen. But in the meantime, for just recovery, to have mutual networks of support, again, that are intersectional in nature, what Katia is talking about, that these are the moments where we can bring all of these resources, all of this knowledge together for the preparation, for the immediate response, and the long-term recovery. So looking at before, during, and after, that we have to, get ourselves together, and that funders have a role in this, and funders can be proactive in supporting this work in advance of the disaster, during the disaster, after the disaster, and not waiting for the disaster to be the moment to be investing in our communities, because we know that we have the solutions. You know, we know how we can be self-determined. We just need y'all to trust us. And so, you know, there is this September, It Takes Roots, CJA is part of It Takes Roots delegation. There's going to be a solutions summit in advance of kind of the False Solutions Summit that is being convened by Jerry Brown, you know, and so really encouraging funders to think about ways that y'all can help us generate the real solutions that we need, because again, we know that we have them. So thank you, and thanks y'all.
Thank you.